5 years ago, I slipped a disc in my back. The next few weeks were full of pain. It was an uncomfortable season, and I spent a lot of time with doctors and physiotherapists and having work on my back and on my muscles and my hips and my legs and all sorts of things. And the recovery was slow. But the physios especially were a real help, both in South Africa and here in Spain. They helped relax my muscles. They helped me recover from the pain. They helped manipulate my joints. They helped rebuild my muscle memory of correct movement. They helped build my muscle just with this manipulation and work on my muscles and my joints. And then they taught me some good exercises that I had to go away and do. And I then had to practice those exercises. I had to learn some new habits of posture. What kind of exercises would build, particularly my core muscles. I had to then do those things. Now, it would have been all well and good for the physios to give me a huge lesson in how the body works and my whole sort of physiology, and I could have learnt a lot and done very little. What actually was really significant was that they taught me 2 or 3 good exercises, and I went away and I did those things a lot. I'm realising that it's actually more important to learn a little and do it a lot than learn a lot and not implement it. I could have left all my exercise for the physios to do for me. They could have done all my muscle manipulation, but that would have been very expensive. It would have taken a long time and it wouldn't have been very sustainable. There was something significant about me learning to put things into practice. And I've realised that this is really key to life and also to faith as a follower. When Jesus called the disciples, he said, "Come and follow me." He was calling them to a life of following in his footsteps, of watching him and of imitating him. Imitation. He was the master and they were the apprentices. And just like a carpenter learns by watching a master carpenter and then practicing what they're doing, so the disciples watched Jesus, learnt from him, copied him, and started doing it. And it's the same with us today. That's our calling, to be followers, to be practicing the life of Jesus. Now, I'm a school teacher by trade. And I taught back in the 90s in the UK. And when we've moved to Mozambique, so this is now around 2000, 2001, we're living in Mozambique. And to be honest, I was missing school teaching. I was missing the interaction with pupils and in classrooms. And I was missing that. And I was doing some limited teaching in churches, but it wasn't the same extent. And I wanted to have more opportunity to teach. So I felt a good way of doing this would be to prepare a week of teaching. So I prepared a week of teaching, particularly on the biblical basis for world mission. I prepared a bunch of teaching and then waited for an opportunity to use what I prepared. Within a couple of years, I think it was in 2002, I had the opportunity to go to Rwanda to teach for a week on a discipleship training school on precisely that subject, the biblical basis for mission. So I went and I taught and I loved it. And I had a really enjoyable time with the students, teaching. And partly through that process, I recognised that I needed the delay. I couldn't just dive into teaching a subject. I needed to really be doing it before I could teach it. And I recognise there's a real principle there that we do first and then we teach. I think of my namesake, Timothy. In the Bible, he grew up clearly in a Christian home. Paul said that he was reminded of his sincere faith that lived first in his grandmother Lois and in his mother Eunice, and now he was persuaded lived in Timothy also. So Timothy learned from his mother and his grandmother, and then Paul tells him that he's then to teach the next generation. He says, "You then, my child, be strong in the grace that's in Christ Jesus, and what you've heard from me through many faithful witnesses, entrust to faithful people who will be able to teach others as well." So Timothy was kind of the 3rd generation after his mother and his grandmother, and he was now to teach a 4th generation, people who would teach it to the next generation, 5 generations. Interesting, isn't it? And so there's this passing on from one generation to the next of the life of following Jesus. But I wonder what it was that Timothy was to teach. Was there a set book of knowledge? Was there a set group of doctrines or something that he was to teach? What was the content that he was to teach? I remember when I was a school teacher back in Devon in England, there was a year 8 class, and it was on the French Revolution. This was a history class. At the time, there was a revolution happening in Indonesia. I thought this was fascinating, and as I was watching this unfold on the news, I was seeing overlaps between Indonesia in the 20th century and France 2 centuries earlier, and recognising some of the inequalities of wealth that there were in Indonesia were very similar to the inequalities in wealth in France. And I was asking myself the question, to what extent does unequal wealth, when you've got gross inequality, to what extent does that create a revolutionary situation? So I introduced this to the class. I was talking about some of the inequalities in Indonesia, and I thought this was fascinating, of course. And then one of these year 8 boys puts his hand up and says, "Sir, do we need to know this for the exam?" Just about the worst question you could ever ask. Do we need to know this for the exam? I wanted to say, no, of course you don't need to know this for the exam. You need to know it for life, though. You see, in the British education system, like in many other systems around the world, there is a lot of emphasis on what we need to know for exams. There's a lot of emphasis on the content that you need to know. Back then, the history curriculum was pretty regimented, what we had to teach, the set knowledge that had to be passed on to this classroom. So little of which they actually needed to know for life. It's interesting, isn't it? Education systems are built up around a lot of content, passing exams, league tables, comparing how schools are doing and achieving these exam grades in this content that the kids are supposed to learn. And I wonder to what extent it could be the same even in churches, a systematic theology that we have to learn, a content that we need to know to be a good follower, or a content that we need to learn in school to be a good citizen. I remember teaching on that first discipleship training school in Rwanda, and I had prepared quite a lot of content that I wanted to teach, and in my mind it was all good content. It was important things. It helped build up an understanding of mission. Of course, I didn't cover all that content in that week. There was no chance I could cover it all. And in a way, whilst I had a great time, I was also a little bit disappointed. I hadn't covered all my content. I wonder what that revealed about me and my view of myself as a teacher. Did I have this stuff that I needed to deliver? Did I see the students almost as empty buckets that I had a responsibility to fill up? Is that a biblical view of mankind? Is that a biblical view of humanity? Empty buckets that we need to fill? And over time, as I taught in more schools like this, I recognised that question, have I covered all my content, was the wrong question to be asking. It wasn't particularly important if I covered all my content or not. I could teach a whole bunch of content and people not learn anything. And so then I started to ask the question, well, what did the students learn? And I recognised that was also a difficult question. How would I ever measure what they learnt? Do we do an exam, like in many education systems? And what does an exam really tell us at the end of the day? We learn something, and then within a day or two of the exam, our short-term memory is forgetting it already, and whilst we could pass the exam, we haven't actually gained anything beyond a short-term memory of some facts. So my question, what did they learn, wasn't really the right question. What did Jesus teach? What did Jesus do? How did he go about it? Did he have set content that he taught? Interesting, isn't it? When he sent the disciples out into the world, Matthew 28, he says, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teach them to obey everything I've commanded you. Jesus told them, go and teach them to obey. Interesting, isn't it? Teach people to obey. He wasn't telling them necessarily the content to teach. He was saying, teach them obedience. Teach them to be obedient people. Teach them to put into practice these words of mine. And so I recognise that a better question to be asking myself at the end of a week of teaching wasn't, did I cover my content? It wasn't, what did the students learn? It was more, what are the students being challenged by? What are the students being challenged to apply What are the students doing differently at the end of the week than at the beginning of the week? What are they doing with what they're hearing? That was the real question. In Acts chapter 14 and 15, Paul is travelling around the churches in Lystra and Derbe, and it tells us that he was strengthening the churches. Eugene Peterson in The Message has a beautiful translation of that. He says that Paul was putting muscle and sinew into the lives of the disciples. Love that translation. Paul was putting muscle and sinew into them. Yes, he was teaching them. Yes, he was encouraging them. Yes, he was exhorting them, but he was helping them develop their muscles. He was building up their muscles. He was a master physio. He was working on their muscles, knowing that their muscles will increase their capacity. Their muscles will help their body move correctly. It will protect the body from injury. They'll be able to do more. They'll recover more quickly. He was working on their muscles. He wasn't working so much on their mind. He was working on their bodies so they could do things and do it differently. Paul was a physio in that sense. I'm also reminded of Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 30, when David, his group of people have been attacked and their wives and children and belongings have been taken away by a band of raiders, and the people are talking of stoning David. And all it tells us is that David strengthened himself in the Lord. Somehow David was able to build muscle and sinew in himself. Paul strengthened other people. David strengthened himself. And ultimately, just like I had to learn, not just to be treated by a physio, I had to learn to do the exercises myself. I realised that ultimately, we need to learn to strengthen ourselves. We need to learn to build our own muscles. We need to learn to practice. We are following in the footsteps of Jesus. We're imitating him, and we need to learn to do those things and to put them into practice. So it's what I do, ultimately, that matters, not what I know. There isn't a set content that if I know that content, I am the right person. I might feel that in my ego. I might feel secure because I know stuff, but it's actually not what about I know. It's more about what I do with what I'm learning. And the best thing really that a physio can do is to help me learn how to look after myself. So I wonder to what extent a good teacher, the best thing they can learn is to teach other people how to learn, to teach other people how to feed themselves, to teach other people how to learn to obey. Because as they obey, they will receive more light. As they put into practice things, they will grow in that and they will learn how to do it better. The only way you can learn carpentry is by watching someone and then picking up the tools and doing it. And the more you do it, the more you learn the skill. The more you practice something, the more it becomes second nature. So I recognised through this process that some of this was actually about dying to my own ego, dying to my own feeling of that I had this core content I needed to pass on. In a way that goes against the grain of much of how schooling and church is done, where the teacher is kind of the guru, standing at the front with knowledge to pass on. There's something about the humility of recognising I don't have all the answers, but that's okay because we're all in this quest together. We're all in a journey. And I don't need necessarily to have the answer. In fact, one of the best answers I've learned is, that's a really good question. What do you think? And that's not a cop-out. It's actually an invitation into the love of learning for ourselves. And I recognise that asking questions is one of the best ways of teaching. Asking good questions. Jesus clearly did it all the time. Who do you say that I am? We see God doing it many times in the Bible. Job is throwing questions at God, and God simply comes back to him and says, well, where were you when I created? Could you do this? What do you think about this? And God's way of inviting Job into a deeper understanding of the mystery of God was to ask him questions. There's something about this journey into the mystery of God, into the beauty of a journey of discovery that's not about passing on a set amount of knowledge, as if once I know these 10 doctrines I've arrived. Actually, I'm growing to know how little I know. I'm growing to recognize there's much more mystery, much more tension, much more holding different things in balance than I ever knew before. And I think that brings into it a gentleness, a meekness, an ability to say, well, yeah, that's really good. I don't know. Let's pursue this together. Let's walk in this journey together. So my views, I suppose, my understanding of teaching, my understanding of my role is changing a lot. I'm realising that imitating, that learning, that practicing, that doing, they're the key things, not knowing. And so I wonder, what are we learning right now in this lockdown period? What are you learning recently? What are some of the things that you're being challenged to do, even as you hear these words? What are you being challenged by? What are you going to try to work and practice in your life going forwards?